I was asked to say something about Syria. So that's what I'm going to try to do. But I can promise you this, by the time I've finished, you'll be as confused as you were before in your innocence. So let's just get to look at some of the maps here. These are the countries involved. And this is the area here that we're talking about. Most people are quite surprised by how small all these areas are. That's Douma, the stronghold of the rebels, and here's Damascus. I'll show you a close-up later on, but meanwhile I want to give you some idea of the wider picture. President Bashar al-Assad is propped up in power by Iran. Most of the area around here is filled with Sunni Muslims. Iran is Shiite, and the Alawites are a small sect who are also Shiites in this area here. They are a very small minority of the Syrian population, but they form the ruling class. And if they lost control, it's probable they'd all be butchered. They're completely surrounded by Sunnis, and the Iranian government is doing all it can to preserve Assad in power, which will help them because it will form some sort of a corridor between Iran and the Mediterranean. Otherwise, the only thing Iran has is the Persian Gulf over here. It's not only the corridor that's important for a communications point of view, but it will also help Iran to control the territorial ambitions of Turkey. So from the Iranian point of view, it doesn't matter the human cost. They want to hang on to their influence in Damascus and their access to the sea and their strategic planning to do with Turkey. And this is why Assad is still hanging on. He would have gone down years ago. He's now making a final onslaught on the city of Douma. So let's get a map of Douma. So here we have Damascus and Douma. Now, I don't think people realise how close all of this stuff is. You see those cities. Here, I'm going to show you the distances. 5 kilometres. That's a 5-kilometre rule. Can you see where it is? You can see why Assad feels so threatened. And he's making a final onslaught on this city, which is the only one in his territory, in the province of Eastern Ghouta, and it's still in the hands of the rebels, but the only one. And the rebels are the Islam Army. Now, if you look at a map kindly provided by the IRIN news agency, as here, you'll get an idea of what the problem is. The area around Damascus here is in Syrian government control. Now, the area around Harasta was under the control of a group called A-Sham there. The area around Erbil was under the control of Failaq A-Rahman. The area around Misraba and Nashabiyah was under the control of the Islam Army, who've now been pushed back to that chunk of land around Douma, and they've been there for 7 years and vow they will not be forced out. Sites like the BBC say there are between 80 and 150,000 civilians in Douma, as well as the Islamist rebels, but other sites point out that estimates in this area are prone to exaggeration. And that's possible because after all those years of fighting, some of the population will certainly have leaked away one way or the other, despite the fact that the rebels have been preventing non-combatants from leaving. They make such good shields, you know. It's all very well for us to criticise Assad's tactics. He is a monster. But then he happens to be fighting monsters as well, and it's very difficult to make a choice between the two. The problem with fighting something like the Islam army is as follows. In a conventional war with conventional soldiers, when an army is surrounded, outnumbered and running out of supplies, generally speaking, some sort of arrangement is made between the two opposing sides. The civilians are allowed to leave, and then the losing side surrenders. The soldiers are then taken prisoner and are treated according to the rules of war. In that way, the men on the losing side can stay alive and some sort of human dignity is preserved. The victorious side then has the responsibility of feeding and housing these prisoners until some sort of a settlement is made or peace is declared, and then the POWs are sent back home. Provided that the prisoners do not misbehave, if the victorious side mistreats or murders them, then when the dust has settled, those responsible are subject to some sort of indictment for war crimes. That's the theory. Obviously, it doesn't work like that all the time. I believe that Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival, the commander of the British forces in Singapore, was under the misapprehension that the Japanese would observe such rules when they accepted the surrender of the British forces in Singapore in 1942. And then the Japanese instead behaved abominably. However, in general it did work in the rest of the world, even during the barbarity of the Second World War. I recently read about a remarkable case that happened in a German POW camp in 1944, when the camp commander ordered Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds, who was the senior non-commissioned officer in charge of the American POWs, he was asked to assemble only the Jewish soldiers so they could be shipped off. Instead, Edmonds assembled all the soldiers, and when he was threatened with a gun, Edmonds told the commandant, "You can shoot me, but you'll have to shoot all of us, and when the war comes to an end, you will be tried as a war criminal." Now, the fact is, it was 1944, and the German officer most likely knew he was on the losing side, so there might have been some shrewd calculation in his giving up the attempt to separate out the Jews, but he did. He gave in and made no further attempts. Also, just to balance things out, not many people know that in 1948, when there was a bit of a dust-up between Jewish fighters and the Arabs, there was a battle at a place called Gush Etzion, which the Jews lost, and they were taken prisoner. And the Jordanian commanding officers at the time, all educated at Sandhurst, the famous British Academy for officers, observed the rules of war to the letter. The Jewish prisoners were held in a Jordanian camp for 7 months and then sent home, as was required. You can't imagine that happening nowadays, can you? I especially wanted to mention that because it's an important point to make. Not all Arabs are the savages we see in our newspapers. For sure, there was a savage element. At the same time as those Jordanian officers were respecting international law, local Arab peasants were pillaging Jewish villages with barbaric ferocity. But the difference is they were doing it for the spoils, not for God. Something dreadful has happened to the Arab world between 1948 and today, and in most cases it seems to be the interposition of God into the equation. Now in Syria, God is all present and there are no rules. Furthermore, on the rebel side, staying alive is not their ambition. The spoils of war are not their ambition. Heaven waits for those who die in combat and take as many of the enemy to hell as possible. Surrender is therefore not an option, and murderous defence, like using civilians or killing civilians, is not a moral quandary. On the other hand, Assad has a problem with Eastern Ghouta. It's right next door to Damascus, the Syrian capital, and it's a pretty big area, and there are many more fighters involved than were involved in the bloody Aleppo battle which caused such a fuss in 2016. To recapture this territory will either be a matter of a bloody and protracted house-to-house fight in which civilians will be used as human shields by the Islam army, or Assad will use a mass killing agent like gas or blanket bombing, which will kill a lot of civilians. The other option is to surround the town and keep the entire population bottled up, in which case the civilians will starve, and the rebels will use their local contacts to replenish their armaments. I'm not arguing for mass killing, by the way, just in case anyone thinks I am. What I am putting before you is the situation. You can make up your own minds about what anyone is supposed to do about it. All I can say is that I hope someone else, brighter than me, has thought of something else, some other way of dealing with this. But I can't.